Hello, everyone. Um, we'll wait just a little bit longer as I see the participant numbers continuing to climb as they're entering the webinar space. Great, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webinar to discuss flexible funding to improve access to transit and transit itself. Today's meeting is being recorded. The presentation will be available on the US DOT Transportation Planning Capacity Building website. That website is located at www.planning.dot.gov/flex, and will be there as a resource to all people. If you need closed captioning and are using the desktop applications, please select the live transcription option found at the bottom of your screen, and that will give closed captioning to the presentation. Please ask any questions at any time using the Q&A pod found at the bottom of the screen. We'll answer questions as we're able to at the end of the presentation. So we're so pleased. I'm Karina Ricks. I'm the Associate Administrator at the Federal Transit Administration, overseeing transit innovation and research. And I'm so pleased to be joined in this panel presentation with our very, very good partners from the Federal Highway Administration, who've really been instrumental in helping us to build out this resource on flexible funding to ensure that we can really optimize the resources available through the bipartisan infrastructure law to invest in safe and sustainable transportation systems and complete streets that support the needs of all people and optimize those investments that we're making in transit and pedestrian and bicycle improvements. I'm going to turn it over to Keith Benjamin. Keith serves as the Associate Administrator for Highway Policy and External Affairs for the Federal Highway Administration at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Keith leads the Office of Policy and Governmental Affairs, where he oversees a variety of activities ranging from congressional affairs, housing FHWA's traffic and transportation performance data, collaborating with the international community on new highway technology, transportation research, and program innovations, and performing various studies and analyses of national transportation policy options. Before Keith joined FHWA, he served as the director of the Department of Traffic and Transportation for the city of Charleston, South Carolina. And there he refocused the department on equitable mobility, and he passed the first ever transportation plan for that city. He represented the city on CARTA, the Transit Association, the Charleston Aviation Authority, and the Berkeley-Charleston-Dorchester Council of Governments. Keith, why don't you give us some opening remarks? Thank you.
Thanks, Karina. I'm excited to be here. Transit was my actual gateway into the transportation world, so it's a real privilege to be able to join you all today. I was thinking this morning, when you've run a local agency, as both of us have, you may not remember names, but you definitely remember faces. And those faces, their concerns, those needs as constituents that you serve every day. And so coming from a local community where less than 10% of our 860 regional transit stops had any accommodations, this conversation really hits home today. I saw many people who did not have the dignity of choice and were regulated to inaccessible mode options. And we, like many different cities, counties, tribes, states, and NPOs, decided to do something about it. Communities like the one I served have maximized all the avenues through policy, development, mitigation measures, and state budgetary requests when it comes to ensuring safe and equitable opportunities in transit, and are looking for additional support. And this is why today's conversation is so important. Flex funding is an excellent example and tool for local communities. And I want to personally recognize the staff at FTA, most especially Karina, for the joint effort that has been put into producing the technical assistance and resources around flex funding. This was a goal that she expressed when we first met, and with the blessing of both of our administrators, our two agencies have worked collectively to improve the conditions of our roadway in every single facet. Having said that, it is not only our goal to help federal aid recipients plan, develop, and implement infrastructure investments that prioritize safety, mobility, and accessibility, but also ensure that the projects are providing an equitable and safe transportation network for travelers of all ages and abilities, including those from marginalized communities facing historic disinvestment. As you may know, equity is one of the main components of President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, which provides considerable resources to help states and other funding recipients advance projects and enable a transportation network to serve all groups, including the marginalized. As you may well know, that over the years, federal highway programs have played a pivotal role in directly supporting and improving pedestrian walkways, trails, lighting, bicycle lanes, and other projects that enhance safety and access to transit. We fully recognize that many of our state DOTs, cities, and tribes have infrequently used federal highways funds for small scale safety and access improvements due to process and requirements that may be suitable for larger projects. This is where federal flex funding from our highway programs to FTA programs comes in as a way to facilitate federal investments at the local level for measures that improve safe access, particularly for disadvantaged communities. And my office will continue to ensure that those investments are reaching and meeting the transportation needs and getting essential services. It's my hope that as you engage in today's discussion, that you think about how these funds can have a positive impact on improving infrastructure for non-motorized travel and public transportation in your state. If you have questions about eligible projects in your state, we highly encourage you to lean into our federal highway division offices that are located in each state, DC and Puerto Rico, for assistance. To close, I really want to emphasize something that Secretary Buttigieg has previously stated. Our focus as an agency, as a department, is to figure out how we are going to deliver the maximum amount of value from the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's that value that takes policy and transforms it into impactful projects. Today's effort to elevate flex funding opportunities does just that. Through collaboration with FTA and my colleagues at Federal Highway, it's our hope that this initiative, along with the many facets of bill, initiates positive change for our transportation system across the country. Thank you all for attending today, and I hope you do enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Keith. And I really can't understate the collaboration that is happening now between the Federal Transit Administration and the Federal Highway Administration to make sure that we're really building out sustainable systems that provide for all Americans. I want to take just a minute. We'll go over, if you can go to the next slide, we'll go briefly over the agenda for the presentation today. So we'll be going over the US DOT strategic goals and how flexible funding or the provision to flex funding between the two agencies serves those goals. We'll provide hopefully a robust overview of what federal flex funding is, how it can be used, the types of projects that are eligible, reasons why it may be beneficial to exercise this option that exists in federal code, an overview of the various FHWA programs that are eligible to be flexed to FTA oversight, and then the requirements that need to be followed in this. Before we begin, I want to take just a moment to look at who might be here today. So we're going to have a couple of interactive polls just to take the pulse of who is here and what your basis of knowledge is. So you should be able, a poll should be popping up now for you to help us understand how familiar are you with this provision to flex funding between the different agencies. Are you just hearing about it because you received information about this curious webinar that is being held? If you perhaps have heard about it before but haven't actually exercised flex funding, or if you have a fairly high level of familiarity with the ability to flex funding in order to facilitate project development. So we'll let that sit just for a second as you participate with us. don't know that I can see if we've gotten finishing with that poll, but we'll go ahead to the next poll. There's the results. So a relatively a new audience to this topic. Thanks. And for those of you, the 25% that have used flex funding, please use this as an opportunity to share with your colleagues, to share your experience of what worked well, what didn't work well, and advice that you might give to your colleagues that are here with an interest in flexing funding. We'll go ahead to poll number 2. For those of you who have or have not used flex funding before, what has been the biggest barrier to exercising this option? Is it simply because you were unaware that it might be an option, because you presumed the exercise of flexing funds to be too cumbersome or difficult to do? Perhaps some of the essential stakeholders in this process were not as supportive of the option to flex funds, or it could be one of any number of other reasons. So if you could take just a moment, again, whether you have or have not flexed funding, why have you not, or if you have, what were the biggest barriers when you experienced that? Okay, let's go ahead and see the results. So again, as we would expect, because many of you, this is a new topic, many were unaware of the option. It is the concerns about the ease of the process is something that we've heard before. We hope that this webinar will help alleviate some of those concerns that you've experienced as to how difficult it may be to use federal funds for these really essential building blocks of a safe and sustainable transportation system. And we'd be curious to hear about what those other concerns are, or other obstacles as well. So thank you to the team for that and for laying that groundwork. So quickly, before we go into the bulk of the presentation, really want to help connect the dots about what we're trying to accomplish on a larger scale. I hope that many of you are familiar with the US DOT strategic goals. These are really the things that we come back to time and time again in every project, in every program, in every effort that US DOT is doing, trying to really check all of these different boxes. We need, first and foremost, for the system to be safe. Too many lives are lost on our transportation systems every year. Even one is one too many. So really striving to ensure that we have safety as that North Star for the organization, that we're doing what we can to build safe systems through and through to really promote that. And we can do that through complete streets, through safety countermeasures, such as sidewalks and protected bicycle lanes and safe crossings. And of course, transit is the safest surface transportation mode that there is. And so the more people that we can get on transit, to the transit system and using transit, the safer our overall system is. Equity, as Keith talked about, is really a key concern of the Biden-Harris administration and every modal entity in the US DOT. And so working to provide access to opportunity and unleash the ability to build wealth and really achieve that economic mobility through transportation mobility. We do have a climate crisis that we're looking at. And so how can we mitigate the effects of climate change and reduce those climate impacts? Again, we can do this by moving people to those more sustainable, low carbon, no carbon modes of travel, of transit, bicycling and walking, so that we can really combat climate change. Working on making the US as economically competitive as possible, really leveraging this robust engine of growth that we have in the US. And that means that we need to give people access to opportunities, again, using all sustainable modes that are available to us. And then finally, transformation. Innovation does not have to take the form of digital systems or high-tech whiz-bang kinds of improvements. Transformation can take the form of good solid sidewalks and curb ramps, quality bus stops, shelters, good operations in the transit space. And so really looking at these strategic goals and the ways that we can leverage every available program and deliver in the quickest and most cost-effective way possible those improvements that support these strategic goals of the administration and of the various modal entities. So really, to get into the meat of the presentation, I want to turn it over to Robert Buckley of the Federal Transit Administration. Robert is the director of the Office of Financial Management and Program Oversight in the Federal Transit Administration, Region 4 out of Atlanta, Georgia. Robert and his team and all of the Region 4 provides oversight reviews, financial tracking, emergency response and recovery activities. They oversee the state program team, grant closeout, and policy and training initiatives. And Robert has had a lot of experience helping the various communities in Region 4, as have his counterparts in regional offices across the US, in supporting transit grantees in leveraging the opportunity of flexible funding to deliver on these programs. So Robert, I'm gonna let you turn it over for everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Karina. I really appreciate that intro. So I'm going to go into, as Karina, can we go to the next slide, please? I'm going to get into a little bit more of the specifics today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what flexible funding is. What are some of the potentially eligible transit access activities that Karina and Keith have alluded to thus far that would be eligible if transferred over to FTA. I'll give you some specifics on the programs, the process, the requirements. We'll talk a little bit about some of the key players, but I've also got some examples thrown in as well to hopefully drive home some of the points to at the very least give you some introduction to flex funds, the process, what some of those projects might look like. But first, you might be wondering, since about half of you had not necessarily heard of flex funding before, what exactly are we talking about? So what is flex funding and what are some of those broad eligibilities that we're talking about? So first, flexible funding is the broad authority to transfer funding between federal agencies. In this case, from federal highways over to FTA. It's actually not a new authority. It was provided by Congress under the 1991 Intermodal Safety Transportation Efficiency Act, known as ICE-T, one of our precursor transportation authorizations. And it can support and enable projects like transit capital improvements. Very frequently, what I see in Region 4, what we see in Region 4 for these flex projects is to flex funding to do things like buy bus replacements or new buses for a particular transit agency, or provide funding to renovate an existing transit facility. But as both Karina and Keith have alluded to now, you can also use this funding for access improvements to and around transit. And what is eligible in and around transit? In 2011, FTA issued a final policy statement on the eligibility of pedestrian and bicycle improvements under federal transit. Basically, what is eligible as far as bike and pedestrian improvements in and around transit station stops and terminals. And in that policy, that final policy statement, basically any sort of pedestrian improvements within a half mile around transit stations, stops, or terminals are de facto related to transit. They have a transit nexus, as we might say at FTA. Similarly, for bicycle improvements, any bicycle improvements providing access to a transit station, stop, or terminal has a de facto relation to transit if it is within 3 miles. So you have a half-mile catchment area for pedestrian improvements and a 3-mile bicycle improvement catchment area. If you remember nothing else from my presentation today, hopefully you remember those two distances in and around transit station, stops, and terminals. Half-mile for pedestrians, 3 miles for bikes. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about some transit access, but what exactly does that mean? Generally speaking, the types of projects that fall under this category, we call them associated transit improvements. Those can be anything from sidewalks, pedestrian access, and walkways. It could be ADA curb cuts, bike lanes, signage in and around the transit station stops and terminals, providing enhanced access for persons with disabilities to public transportation, bus shelters, lighting around the transit station stops and terminals, and some functional landscaping and streetscaping. All of those are example projects that could be funded under this umbrella of associated transit improvements within that, again, half mile for pedestrian improvements and 3 mile catchment area around the transit station stops and terminals. One note I do want to give while I'm thinking about bikes and before we go on to our next example is that while bicycles themselves are not eligible, bikes are not eligible as a public transit, bike sharing infrastructure is. So on-road bike lanes, grade separated bikeways near a transit corridor, and moving into my first example, bike lockers at rail stations. Next slide. So for my first example today, to hopefully give you a little bit of a feel for what types of projects have been transferred over and been successful in the past, is in the town of Milford, Connecticut. The town of Milford partnered with the Milford Transit District to install 25 bike lockers at the Milford train station. It's a station that largely serves riders commuting to New York City. And there was an interest in the community for a longer term secure bike parking, given the long hours those bikes were stored for the commuters. Adding that bike parking also fit into the larger community plans to increase access to and encourage development around transit. And before the pandemic of March of 2020, the lockers were extremely well used. And the Milford Transit District does expect, as the commuter activity is starting to grow again, the lockers are going to gain even more usage. This project was funded, it's a total of $70,000. So this is not a large scale project, but it was funded 80% with CMAQ funding. And I've got a slide later on for what are the individual programs, but CMAQ is Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program. The transit district was able to work with the town to transfer those funds over, and the transit district was able to put those lockers at the transit station. Next slide. So why flex funds? Why are we talking about this now? The authority was actually given to us back in 1991, right, under ICE-T. FTA issued our final policy statement in 2011. So what is the why? Why are we talking about this now? Well, I don't know that I can build any more on the why than what Karina and Keith went through today. But the example in Milford is a great example of one of the whys. It's really about facilitating and increasing the investment in bike and pedestrian improvements around transit. It's about encouraging the connectivity between the transit routes, stations, stops, and terminals, and the adjacent communities. We have seen, and I'll go through some examples where the transferring these funds over from federal highways to FTA has seen some reduced costs associated with project delivery and accelerating project delivery in some cases. But really, it's about what Karina and Keith talked about at the outset. It's about encouraging that complete trip network design and providing the increased safety and accessibility of the transit network. And as Keith said, it's providing access for people of all ages and abilities, including those from marginalized communities facing historic disinvestment. One other benefit that we have seen is on some of our discussions as we prepared for the rollout of this initiative was some of the coordination that is promoted and strengthened around some of these transfers. As you're going to see, it does take coordination with transit agencies and regions and cities and counties and municipalities to make these makes this flexible funding happen. And so seeing some of that increased coordination has been another beneficial byproduct of this process. Next slide. So the next example I wanted to run through just to kind of give you another kind of win scenario when transferring these funds was in Milpitas, California, with the Montague pedestrian overcrossing. The Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, VTA, worked with Santa Clara County and the city of Milpitas to construct a pedestrian overpass across that expressway, connecting a high-density residential and commercial area with a new Bay Area rapid transit BART station in Milpitas. The city owns, operates, and maintains the overcrossing, which really provided a critical access to that station. And as Karina and Keith outlined, is really a much safer access to that station rather than having to cross what I imagine is a very busy expressway. VTA, the Valley Transportation Authority, applied to the MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, on behalf of the city for some more CMAQ money for design and construction of the project, and then transferred the funding over to FTA. In this case, transferring the funding, allowed for a more flexible and streamlined process. It also allowed the project to move forward on a faster timeline, which was really necessary in Mil Pizza's case to use the funding, given that it would have been difficult to go through Caltrans. They had some capacity, Caltrans specifically had some capacity issues at the time that might have prevented them from overseeing the project. VTA was able to use some of the federal money to hire a contractor to oversee the project, which ensured all the federal and local protocols and standards were followed. And you can see some of the cost on this one is a total of $21.7 million for this overpass, about half of which was funded by that CMAQ money flexed from federal highways over to FTA. Next slide. So I've mentioned CMAQ already. What are some of the other FHWA programs that can move over to FTA? The two that I see most frequently, and I'm sure most of my regional colleagues would agree with me, is CMAQ, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program, again, and the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. Those are the two most frequently transferred programs from federal highways to FTA, and both can fund these transit access type improvements that we're talking about today to increase that safety, accessibility, connectivity of the transit service in your area. Another one that can also be transferred and has some of these same eligibilities is the Transportation Alternatives Program. It's another one that can also be transferred from federal highways to FTA. Two more that can be transferred but are much less common, although technically eligible to be flexed, are the Highway Safety Improvement Program and the National Highway Performance Program. The other ones listed on here, the Ferry Boat Program and the State Planning and Research, are either flexed or transferred over, can be either flexed or transferred over to FTA. But for the Ferry Boat Program, for example, probably not using that program to fund transit access improvements. That is probably being flexed over for ferry operations, ferry capital improvements, things like that. Next slide. So you're probably wondering, what are some of the federal requirements for these flex funds, right? Like, you obviously can't get out of all the federal requirements just from going from one agency to another. So a couple of things to remember is, if you're going from federal highways to FTA, you're not going to get a better match rate necessarily going from federal highways to FTA. Typically, capital projects funded under our two administrations are funded at 80%. So that is probably the max rate that you're going to get for FTA or federal highways to participate in your project. The other thing that is so important is that the eligibility, like, your project must be eligible under both federal highways and FTA. Obviously, if you're going to get selected for federal highway funds, whether those be CMAQ or STBG, you've got to be eligible to receive that money under the program, right? Very similarly, if you're going to transfer that money to FTA, it's got to be eligible under FTA's programs. That's where that 2011 final policy statement on pedestrian and bike improvements is important. That's where that catchment area, which hopefully everybody remembers now, is half mile for pedestrian improvements, 3 miles around station stops and terminals for bicycle improvements, is so key. It's got to be eligible under FTA's programs. And then once it's transferred from federal highways to FTA, it does fall under FTA oversight. So if I have any transit folks on the line today, and you receive our normal triennial review, which is part of our FTA oversight process, these funds, the grant associated with them, would be looked at during that normal triennial review process. You also have to coordinate through your regional office. It's very important to keep the regional office in the loop on these. Number one, to make sure projects are eligible, they fall within the catchment areas. But also, you're going to have to work with your regional office to complete a grant in our grant management system in order to access those dollars once they're transferred from federal highways to FTA. Next slide. So just going through some of the key players in this process. The project sponsors are obviously important. They are the ones who are going to be developing the project, supporting any flex request. They may be the ultimate implementers of the project, the ones actually doing and overseeing the construction on the ground. MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, are also key in this process. They award funding within the region and are a key stakeholder in the process, including making sure your project is included in the local transportation improvement program, or your TIP in the state's TIP. State DOTs, they are the principal grantee of federal highways dollars. They are the ones who must submit the request to flex the funds to the Federal Highway Division offices. The transit agencies, they are very typically the FTA direct recipients. They are the ones who already have that direct recipient relationship with FTA. And so they're going to be important because they are probably the ones who are going to come in for a grant to FTA for this money. You do want to make sure you work through them, and they may directly implement the project in some cases, or they can establish a subrecipient agreement to allow a local city, county, municipality to actually be the one implementing the project on the ground. The last two key players, maybe I'm biased, but I think are also very important, FTA and FHWA. Both of our agencies must approve the flex. Again, it's got to be eligible. And then Federal Highways would transfer the obligation authority to FTA, who would then provide that oversight of the flexed project. Next slide. So getting a little bit more into the specifics of that flex process. The first part of this process is really locally driven. It is about the local sponsors preparing the project, confirming eligibility, ensuring that stakeholder engagement that I talked about at the outset, that their local, regional, state, and transit agencies are all on the same page that, hey, we understand what the requirements are, we want to transfer it over, everybody's on the same page there. And then you develop the project and submit them for consideration at the regional or state level. And again, ensuring that the projects are eligible under Federal Highways and FTA is key. This is where outreach to your FHWA division offices, as Mr. Benjamin mentioned, is important. Also reaching out to your FTA regional offices to confirm it's eligible and makes sense to transfer is incredibly important as well. Next slide. The next stage of the process is actually where the funding gets transferred generally in behind the scenes. So the request for the flex using the FHWA transfer form is provided. The project sponsors might provide letters of support to go with that flex. That could include the transit agency or the local government. And as I mentioned before, the state DOT is actually the one who completes the transfer form, 1575 for anybody who knows what form I'm talking about, and submits to Federal Highways. And then the FHWA division offices are responsible for ensuring eligibility and federal requirements, and they might work with FTA to help do that. And this is the point in the process where there can be some time. It can take up to 60 days to transfer those actual dollars from the Federal Highways Division Office up to their headquarters, over to FTA headquarters, until the funding is finally available at the regional office for the FTA to work with our direct recipient. Next slide. So the last part is that once the funds have been received by the FTA regional office, that's the point where that direct recipient can work with their FTA regional office for a grant in our grant management system, we call it TRAMS, to actually gain access to those dollars. At the same time, the direct recipient may establish a subrecipient agreement to complete the project and ensure all the federal requirements are being followed. And work can begin once those funds are all obligated. Ultimately, the FTA direct recipient is responsible for ensuring all the federal requirements are met. That is important for the FTA direct recipients out there. Next slide. So I've alluded to it a couple times. You have some options for project delivery, and it's really about what makes sense with your project and in your local area. It may be advantageous to your area and your agency for the FTA direct recipient who maybe has more capacity to implement projects in communities with fewer resources. So maybe they are the ones who are actually implementing the project on the ground. Sometimes regional transit agencies may be better positioned to work across multiple jurisdictions if that is a feature of your project. However, a lot of transit agencies may not have that capacity to implement roadway infrastructure improvements directly. A lot of transit agencies are just focused on providing the service, preventive maintenance, and the normal work of providing transit to a community, and maybe don't have that roadway infrastructure knowledge. And that is fine. In that case, maybe it makes sense for a local sponsor that has more of that roadway infrastructure capacity to be the one implementing the project on the ground. In that case, we do require a subrecipient agreement, and for the FTA direct recipient to ensure that oversight takes place and that all the federal requirements are followed. All right, next slide, and my last example of the day is in Houston, Texas, in the Bissonnet pedestrian transit improvements. And hopefully this one really drives it home for everybody on the call today. In this case, the Upper Kirby Management District and the Upper Kirby Redevelopment Authority in Houston, Texas, applied for and received funding for streetscape improvements along a half-mile corridor that was served by a number of intersecting fixed routes by Houston Metro. The Kirby Management District and Redevelopment Authority were able to work with Houston Metro to transfer those funds over. And the project included constructing and improving sidewalks, ADA compliant ramps, crosswalks, pedestrian signals, functional landscaping, and transit-related street infrastructure. All the things that we're talking about that can make transit safer, more accessible, more connected to the communities. And transferring the funds to FTA allowed the Upper Kirby Management District, who in this case was the ultimate implementer of the project under a subrecipient agreement, to implement the project consistent with some of their local design and project delivery processes, while still ensuring that all the federal requirements like civil rights, procurement, and NEPA were all followed. And it's another case where managing the project locally led to overall cost and schedule savings. As far as the dollar amounts in this case, the total cost of this project was $8 million. And actually only 23% of it was STBG funds, the Surface Transportation Block Grant funds, that were transferred over to Houston Metro to apply directly to FTA. Next slide. So as we open the poll, as my partners open the poll to you guys, I hope that my presentation today has given you a better sense of what flexible funding is. What are some of the potentially eligible transit access activities that can help improve the safety, accessibility, connectivity, first mile, last mile connections in your areas, and are eligible to be transferred over to FTA. I gave you an overview of what are some of the specific programs, right? CMAQ, STBG, some of the requirements and key players, and hopefully some of those examples gave you some hope for how these projects can improve your community. And again, if nothing else, remembering that transit access activities for FTA are half mile around transit station stops and terminals for pedestrian improvements, and 3 miles from any bicycle improvements around transit stops and stations and terminals, excuse me. And so now, hopefully, you are now more likely to use flex funds for your future project. And I am seeing now that folks are hopefully much more likely. So I'm going to stop talking. I'll be here for any questions you guys might have, and I'm going to turn it back over to Karina. Thanks, Karina.
Great. Thanks, Robert. And thanks for that great presentation. So I want to remind everybody, we've had some robust conversations happening in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So other questions that are arising, I would encourage you to use that function. We'll get to as many of them as we can. I would also remind you about the Flex Funding website, and we'll get that presentation, that site on the screen in a short while, where you can go to the frequently asked questions section, where we will continue to build out those FAQs as we receive questions from this and other places of input, and you can get the answers there. As Robert mentioned, your best source of information always, and they're there to help, are your FHWA division offices and your FTA regional offices. They will assist you in this program and to do that. So we'll get to a few of these questions. Robert, you might want to stay on screen as I pitch some of them, perhaps to you to answer. In overall, just want to reiterate a couple of things that Robert said to make sure that we're clear. One is that flexible funding is not a new or unique source of funding in and of itself. It's a characteristic that allows you to move other funding programs. So funding programs that exist, it provides flexibility in moving those funds between FTA and FHWA, between FHWA and FTA. So it's not a unique funding source in and of itself. And that all of the provisions of when it is flexed from FHWA to FTA, it does need to adhere to FTA eligibilities. So just as that caveat, let's begin with one of the first questions, and we'll just continue to kind of move through these questions. So Robert, I'm going to maybe have you answer. It's a bit of a softball. We've had a number of questions about specific projects and what requirements they need to follow with regard federal requirements regarding right-of-way, NEPA, accessibility, civil rights, federal procurements. What do they need to follow? This should be a softball for you.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're using federal funding, all of those requirements are going to apply. And so that is where it is key to work with your division or regional office to make sure that you are going to be compliant with any of those requirements.
So the timeline, we've seen various questions come forward. The timeline that we have estimated is that it takes about 60 days or 2 months from the time that the state DOT makes the written request to the Federal Highway Administration to flex funds over to FTA. That's a ballpark number, and sometimes there will be variabilities in that. Again, it's going to sound like reiterating the same answer over and over again, but please work with your FHWA division offices and FTA regional offices. They can assist if you're experiencing a delay in the flexing of those funds or the turnover of those, and they can provide guidance as to how to keep those funds moving again. One question that was raised was with regard to the FHWA's program for disadvantaged communities. And we will put that resource where you can find the link to the designated disadvantaged communities. We'll put that in the chat. However, a reminder that the flexible funding, while we do have it is one of the strategic goals of USDOT to lift up some of those disadvantaged communities, flex funding is not restricted only to those disadvantaged communities. So the link is there as a resource to you. However, flex funding is applicable, as Robert said, anywhere within a half mile of any fixed route transit stop, bus stop, for a pedestrian improvement, or 3 miles for a bicycle improvement. Robert, I'm going to ask this question to you. If you are not a direct recipient of FTA funds, can you still use flex funding?
Thank you, Karina. Yes, you can. If you are not a direct recipient, you can work with your local transit agency or another direct recipient in your area and establish that sub-recipient agreement that I was talking about. It's important to note, as you said, these are not new funds that you're applying for into this program, and you want to make sure you follow the eligibility and programming rules for the programs identified as eligible for flexing. But yes, you can still work with the direct recipient to receive those dollars.
Great. And as a reminder, many of you will find that your transit partners in the region also have shared agendas to improve that access to transit for bicycle and pedestrian improvements. And so you'll probably find a partner in arms in assisting you in using that flex funding provision, if that is the right approach for the delivery of your project. There's a question that asks, when you flex funds, will the state contribution to the federal share also be flexed? And a related question of will the federal local share change when those funds are flexed to FTA? So for example, the Highway Safety Improvement Program, or HSIP program, is a 90% federal share and 10% local match. Whereas most of the flexed programs that go to FTA are a 80% federal share and a 20% local share. So the answer to that is that the share requirement continues from the original program. So that continues. So if you are flexing HSIP funding to FTA oversight, the match requirements of the HSIP program continue, even though oversight is provided by FTA. The local funds are a commitment when you are granted any flavor of federal funds. So in order to access FHWA funds or FTA funds, there needs to be a commitment of those local funds for the local share. That commitment of local funds, whether it's state funding or local funding, that commitment needs to also accompany the overall project as it's flexed over from FHWA to FTA oversight. Robert, could you explain one more time what counts as an associated transit improvement?
Yes, absolutely. So the term associated transit improvement is, for those who might want to dig into the CFR, is defined under 49 CFR 5302. And it basically requires transit improvements to be physically or functionally related to transit facilities. And this can include things like bus shelters, pedestrian access and walkways, bicycle access, and a couple other categories of eligible improvements that I went through in the presentation.
Great. So, and again, the associated improvements are on the frequently asked questions website. I might jump ahead to one of the other questions that was raised that asked about functional landscaping and what functional landscaping might be. Most commonly, what you might see are green infrastructure projects associated with street improvements or bicycle or pedestrian improvements. Those might be rain gardens or bioswales or other kinds of improvements. Functional landscaping might also be street trees that provide a function. So perhaps not strictly beautification efforts, so hanging baskets and those kinds of things, but rather functional landscaping is considered an associated transit improvement because it makes transit better when those improvements are there. A question was raised about why can't FHWA administer these projects directly? Why do they need to be transferred to FTA? They don't need to be transferred. FHWA obviously does a very good job in the respective state grantees in delivering billions and billions of dollars of transportation improvements around the country. However, there are times when these smaller, widely distributed, lower cost projects, because they are much smaller in scale, they can be subjected to oversight processes that are much oriented toward much larger projects through the state management arrangements. And so it may be, depending on the nature of the project and depending on the stewardship agreement of your state, it may be that the FTA oversight process may provide a more appropriately scaled oversight process than the state managed FHWA oversight process. And so FHWA absolutely can and typically does oversee these kinds of projects and does it in a very great way. The flexibility, though, allows you a different route if necessary to improve project delivery through the FTA oversight process. Robert, will flex funding help to improve bus stops and make them more ADA accessible?
Yes, absolutely. So bus stop improvements are definitely eligible under flex fund improvement, under flex funding, and including making those stops ADA accessible. That is absolutely eligible. It can make improvement.
Correct. That's and I want to reiterate, because I know we've been emphasizing a lot about access to transit and using flex funding to improve access to transit. Just to reiterate, flex funding can be used to improve transit itself as well. And that's actually one of the most common uses today, is to buy transit vehicles, invest in high capacity transit ways, and to improve transit stops. There is a question that asks, if CMAQ funds are flexed to another agency, how does the locality get those funds back to reprogram to another CMAQ project? And again, this goes back to that answer that flex funding is not a new source of funding. So this really goes to the oversight of the CMAQ, which is the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program. The Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program allocations are generally determined by your metropolitan planning organization in coordination with your state DOT. And so those determinations of when a project is awarded CMAQ funding is made generally by your metropolitan planning organization. So where it is flexed for administration and oversight doesn't change the general awards that are made. So when CMAQ funds are flexed, they go together with that project award. They can also be flexed in general prior to project selection as a programmatic shift to support transit. And so those funds can also be moved from those purchases. Robert, does bike share, two questions. Are bike share and or scooter share stations eligible to be used for flex funding? And I'm going to augment that and ask, are the shared bicycles or the shared scooters themselves eligible to use if funds are flexed to FTA?
Sure. So the bike share station infrastructure and the infrastructure themselves are eligible, but not the actual bicycles or scooters.
Okay, say that one more time.
Sorry, bike share stations and infrastructure are eligible, but not the actual bicycles or scooters.
So just want to reiterate that there are programs that FHWA administers in which they can support the scooters and bikes themselves, but those funds cannot be flexed to FTA oversight. Those funds for those improvements need to remain with FHWA oversight, and that's an element of statute. Robert, one more question for you. When funds are flexed from FHWA to FTA, what program are they deposited into?
Most frequently, they go into the Section 5307 Urbanized Area Formula Program, but it is possible to be flexed into other capital programs as well. It'll depend a little bit on the specific situation, but most commonly 5307.
A question was asked about the role of the state DOT in flexing funds in flexing funds from FHWA to FTA. Could you explain the role of the state, Robert?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, the state DOT is the principal grantee of federal highways funds, and they are actually the ones who initiate that formal process of flexing the funds from federal highways to FTA. They must sign off and they submit a written request to the Federal Highway Division Office to do that. After that, the funding and oversight process is shifted to FTA through your local regional office.
Great, thank you. Just answering a little bit of a repeat question. Do flex funds require locally matched funds? Again, flex funding is not a unique source of funding. Flexibility is a characteristic that exists in many FHWA funding programs. Each one of those FHWA funding programs does have a local match requirement. And so that local match requirement must still be met, whether that project has FHWA oversight or has FTA oversight. So there's still a local match. An additional question related that was asked, not here, but otherwise, was if you flex FHWA program funds over to FTA, can the FHWA funds serve as the match to FTA funds? And they cannot. Local match must be non-federal funds. Robert, can a local municipality be the project sponsor as long as they're working with or through the transit agency. Or let me amend that a little bit further to say, must they work with or through the transit agency to be a project sponsor?
They do need to work through an existing FTA direct recipient who is most frequently that local FTA transit, or excuse me, FTA local transit agency. So yes, they need to go through an existing FTA direct recipient.
Great, thank you. And as we're coming up against time, I really want to thank everyone for their participation. We've had tremendous turnout at this webinar. I really want to thank Robert and all of his counterparts across all of the FTA regional offices and the FHWA division offices, all of the respective state DOTs who are critical partners in this, all of the thousands of transit grantees around the country who really, we're all in this together, really all working toward that goal of creating a safe system, getting towards zero deaths, really improving the opportunity for equity and delivering on equity and mitigating the effects of climate change. So this is an important step in doing that. It can be a really vital tool to deliver those projects, to be able to choose the oversight process, whether it's FHWA or FTA, that's going to really facilitate the delivery of these critical safety improvements, improvements to the delivery of transit and transit services and accessibility for everyone. So really appreciate, I know that there's some questions we haven't been able to respond to. We will provide answers to all of these questions again on the shared resource page and provide those frequently asked resources. We continue to invite your input into how we can make this resource that much better for all people. Please feel free to contact us at the Flex Funds at DOT.gov. The website will be posted by the end of the webinar will be posted on the website by the end of the week so that you can continue to use this and share this with your colleagues around the country so that, again, we can build knowledge in the ability to use this tool and deliver these safe systems for everyone. We'll be ending the webinar now. Please note that at the conclusion of the webinar, there will be a short evaluation that will pop up. We really encourage you, again, to take just a minute or two to answer that so that, again, we can provide better services to all people around the country and gather more information about this flex funding resource. So to our friends at FHWA, Keith and Wesley and the whole team that's been just amazing collaborators with us, to the large team at FTA, and to all of our colleagues across every level of government working to deliver these projects. Thank you so much, and we look forward to helping you more.